But I want to bring us back to Syria because you've been doing some work on reporting on Syria recently, and I'd like your insights on that.
Yes, well, dovetailing from 9/11 into Syria is easy to do because I have to tell your listeners, I came to the conclusion after studying 9/11 for 4 or 5 years now intensively that Israel was involved in the 9/11 attacks. People can look up an ABC News article, mainstream source. Were the Israelis arrested on 9/11 spies is the title of that article. Fox News actually for once did a very good piece of journalism in which they exposed the Israeli connections to 9/11. The airports were run by one Israeli company on 9/11. And I believe that basically the American empire would be irrational to have done 9/11 on its own, would have been irrational to have waged the 9/11 wars in the way that they were prosecuted, because the American empire is exactly that. It's an empire, and it can use market imperialism and other mechanisms to control the Middle East. It had no interest in attacking itself on 9/11. I do think, however, it would be highly rational for Israel to have staged a provocation in the United States on 9/11 in order to entice the American people and the American leadership into a war against its enemies, where it would have been more rational for the American empire to have cozied up with Arab leaders post-Cold War and to have abandoned Israel, who, of course, milks it for billions of dollars of taxpayers' money every year. And if we look into the scholarship of who the neoconservatives were and what their agenda was, if we look at people like Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feist, both of whom lost their security clearances in the 1980s for passing classified documents to Israel, individuals like Richard Pohl, Michael Ledeen, who was implicated in Iran-Contra, which was serving Israel's interests to a large extent. We see that the neocons had deep, deep ties to the state of Israel. And if we exclude Rumsfeld and Cheney as aberrations, because they kind of were, they had their own little interests as kind of redundant Cold Warriors. You see this whole slew of books in the liberal press about Rumsfeld, Cheney, Bush, right? But if you look at everyone else in the neocon movement, to a large extent, they're pretty much all Zionists. And that's a hard truth that we have to face. And if people can't face that, like it's the same with 9/11, the left have been a failure. Likewise on Zionism, the left are a failure. I think I'm being a good Marxist, a proper Marxist, by opposing ethnic obscurantism and colonialism in the Middle East. And that's why I am drawing attention to this evidence. Now, Syria is a symptom of this neocon policy because there is a great deal of scholarship emerging from Israel, I'll emphasize. For example, a paper called A Strategy for Israel in the 1980s by Oded Yinon, which people can Google. And I think this is a good indication of what the Likud Party's ideology was to be. Of course, the Likud Party ascended to power in 1977 was their first victory. And that was one from shifting away from trying to negotiate with Arab leaders and get the U.S. to kind of act as a buffer between Israel and Arab leaders and to stop, to try and make some coexistence, to shift away from that policy to one of attacking the Arab leaders, to destabilizing the Middle East, so Israel can effectively make an empire in the Middle East. This is what the South Africans tried to do. They tried to destabilize Angola and all their surrounding countries, and it was completely rational from an ethnic nationalist state perspective to do so. Likewise, Israel now has departed from any semblance of trying to negotiate or create, some peace with its neighbors. I believe to trying to make them fight each other, just for militarism. Because if they're fighting each other, they won't be able to get their act together to resist the hegemon, the Israeli Zionist hegemon in the Middle East. And unfortunately, the Western media has been selling us a bill of goods vis-a-vis Syria. They've been telling us that these Al-Qaeda-style, Salafist, Muslim Brotherhood type militants, insurgents in Syria are some kind of human rights activists. There is a thin layer of genuine pro-democracy forces in Syria, but to a large extent, more than 50% of Syrians. The people from Syria who I've interviewed in Calgary claim 80%. Dr. Mohammed al-Masri, who doesn't like Assad, claims 50% of Syrians love Assad. And that's something that's, a circle that can't be squared from the perspective of those who are thinking they're supporting human rights. The events in Syria, the Middle East is highly multifarious, it's highly complex. And the Middle East can't be sort of generalized. All the strife in the Middle East and all the events that are unfolding can't be kind of generalized under the rubric of the Arab Spring. Mubarak in Egypt, for example, had about 5% popularity. Assad has 50 to 80% popularity, as is indicated by the pro-Assad protests in Damascus where millions of people turn out. Now the propaganda is, they get blackmailed into going. Are you telling me millions of Syrians turn out to support Assad because there might be ramifications for their family? I don't think so. And there's many interviews you can see with people on the streets of Homs, for example, saying, if the military are withdrawing anymore, we're going with them because there are foreign fighters coming in. The same people who were sent in by NATO and Israel to destabilize Libya are now being deployed from Turkey into Syria to destabilize Syria and to foment sectarianism. And of course, in Egypt, while the Arab Spring was happening, while the Egyptian Revolution was happening, people were missing, of course. There were bombs going off in the Coptic churches. And even the Jerusalem Post, people could look up an article in which they cite the Egyptian Lawyers Guild, alleging that they were Mossad false flag attacks. It's quite an easy policy for Israel to pursue. On the surface, they tell us they're looking for peace and they're just a little Jewish state in the Middle East, surrounded by all these crazed Arab regimes. But in practice, they go around the Middle East, letting off bombs in Shia and Sunni mosques, blaming it on each camp, letting bombs off in Coptic churches. Syria has 18 ethnic groups, which President Assad unifies. He unites Syria. So I would say as a leftist, one has to be for self-determination and against ethnic sectarianism. I'm against both of them as a good socialist. And so I know there'll be some who will try to paint what I'm saying as anti-Semitic or racist or whatever, but that canard won't wash anymore. I believe that we should stand in solidarity with Syrian sovereigntists. I saw an interview with the leader of the Syrian Socialist Party, and even he was saying, although politically he's singing from a different hymn sheet to President Assad, that he's with President Assad insofar as he's trying to assert Syrian and unify the different ethnic groups who the imperialist countries are trying to pit against each other in order to weaken Syria. And I think this is crazy from the U.S. empire's perspective, really. I think this is crazy from Canada's perspective. It's only rational if you're sitting in Tel Aviv looking out at the natives, as it were, and trying to see how you could create your empire. The British had their empire, the French had their empire, the Belgians had their empire. Why can't we Israelis have our empire? Will be what such people are thinking. And our job as leftists is to draw attention to that, not to buy the propaganda we're given by the CBC that this is, there's an election going on right now in Syria, and I heard the whole of the way in my car today, I heard them interviewing this so-called Syrian National Council who don't support the elections, in which there's 7,000 candidates running. President Assad is engaging in reforms in Syria. He's more of a Hugo Chavez than a Hosni Mubarak, I'll tell you that. And people on the left who are getting hoodwinked into going to these so-called pro-democracy protests in North America, in which these people adopt the Syrian flag. They adopt the three-starred Syrian flag, which was used under the French mandate when French imperialists controlled Syria. So they've rejected the Syrian independence flag. It was Syrian Independence Day a couple of weeks ago. And the people go to these so-called pro-human rights rallies and wave the French-imposed colonial flag of Syria. And the end that it's achieving is one of imperialism. And really, this is the genius of the neoconservative movement. They managed to sell imperialist wars of aggression. Not that they were, Christianizing the heathens or civilizing the savages, but rather they were democratizing those who really want democracy against these Arab regimes. I think there's also a nihilistic problem which has emerged from the rejection of a conception of progress on the left, thanks to postmodern nihilists rejecting any kind of modernist notions of progress. I think there's this concept that anything's better than an Arab strongman. Now, if we want to emancipate the working class, if we actually care about the working class, we have to agree that Syria under Assad, imperfect as it is, where there's peace on the street, where working class people aren't slaying each other, is far better than the alternative, which is working class people killing each other, a bloodbath. And I think what happens is, I interviewed the famous Syrian girl, the girl who goes by the anonymous name Syrian girl recently, and she said it very brilliantly. She said, left-wing people have a cookie-cutter image of what a revolutionary looks like. In other words, we see a bearded man on the streets of Damascus or in Homs with a gun, and we think, he must be a revolutionary against these Arab dictators that people like Chomsky have encouraged us to, focus on so much rather than on the main threat in the Middle East, which is, of course, nuclear Israel. And so I believe that we should recognize that Assad is not perfect, but he's a lot better than, we should be careful what we wish for, because he's a lot better than the 18 ethnic groups in Syria fighting each other with Western-sponsored or Israeli-sponsored false flag attacks, blowing up each other's holy sites, and breaking down Syria for the sole purpose of allowing these European Ashkenazis who didn't even emerge from Palestine, who come from Central Asia historically. Of course, the Palestinians are actually the real descendants of the Jews of Palestine. That these Ashkenazi European settlers in Palestine can retain regional hegemony. I won't support that, and I think as a good leftist, we should stand with President Assad's attempt to assert Syrian sovereignty. If they were trying to fragment a piece of Venezuela off, like they did when they tried to get the mayor of an oil-rich province of Venezuela to secede, we'd all support Hugo Chavez going in with tanks and military might to reassert Venezuelan sovereignty. Likewise, because President Assad is using tanks and weapons, they're the realities of power. And a lot of left-wing people can't face power because they kind of have this kind of very idealistic notion of what emancipation is. They have a cookie-cutter image of what a revolutionary is. And right now, for most Syrians, Assad is the revolution, and those so-called human rights activists are the serpents of sectarianism. They are the forces of reaction that are being resisted by those Syrian sovereigntists.
Well, Joshua Blakeney, why are you holding back? Why don't you tell us exactly what you feel about the situation in Syria? I'm just kidding. Thank you for that really great picture of how you see things. We're going to take another music break right now, a commercial break. We'll be right back to conclude the show. So stay with us, Joshua.